today's video, I will explain the poem A Photograph by Shirley Toulson. Before we start with the explanation, first let's begin with the introduction of the poem. The poem is a tribute to the poet's mother. It describes 3 stages in the passage of time, as it depicts the 3 different stages of life, that is, early adolescence, adulthood, and death. In the first stage, the photograph shows the poet's mother standing at the beach enjoying her holiday with her 2 girl cousins. She was around 12 years old at that time. Then, in the second stage, it takes us 20 or 30 years later. The mother would laugh at the way she and her cousins were dressed up for the beach holiday. Then, finally, in the third stage, the poet remembers the dead mother with a heavy heart. The photograph revives a nostalgic feeling in the poet. Now, let's move on to the explanation of the poem. So, I will read out each stanza and will explain it as we go on. Stanza 1. The cupboard shows me how it was when the 2 girl cousins went paddling, each one holding one of my mother's hands, and she, the big girl, some 12 years or so. So, in the first stanza, an old photograph of the poet's mother, which was pasted on cardboard, makes the poet recall the old memories of her mother's childhood. The photograph is a depiction of her mother's enjoyable moments at a sea beach with her 2 cousins who were younger to her. They were walking in shallow water with bare feet near the beach. The mother was standing in the middle and was holding hands of her 2 cousins, who were standing on each side. The poet's mother was 12 years old then. It shows that the photograph was very old, but the poet has kept it very carefully as it reminded her of sweet memories of her mother's childhood. The photograph also indicates how enjoyable her mother's childhood was. Stanza 2. All 3 stood still to smile through their hair at the uncle with the camera, a sweet face, my mother's, that was before I was born, and the sea, which appears to have changed less, washed their terribly transient feet. In this stanza, the photograph shows that all 3 girls, the poet's mother and her 2 cousins, stood still and smiled at the camera when their uncle clicked their photograph at the sea beach. As the weather was windy at that time, their hair was flying over their smiling faces. The expression on their faces of the poet's mother and her cousins was that of happiness and enjoyment. The mother was looking very pretty at that time, and the photograph was taken a long time ago. Everything has changed since then. Her mother grew up, now she was dead, and the poet was reviving her memories. The only thing that has remained unchanged is the sea, which was washing the feet of all 3 girls. The mention of the word transient here indicates the ever-changing lives of human beings, as well as the shortness of their stay on this world. In contrast to the eternality of nature, the girl's life changed drastically during this period, but the sea has not changed. So, this stanza has beautifully explained the transient nature of human beings. Now, let's move on to stanza 3. Some 20-30 years later, she'd laugh at the snapshot. She, Betty, and Dolly, she'd say, and look how they dressed us for the beach. The sea holiday was her past, mine is her laughter, both wry with the labored ease of loss. In the stanza, even 20 to 30 years later, the mother would look at the photograph and laugh nostalgically, remembering the happy memories of her past. Mother would look at the photograph and comment on the dresses worn by the cousins Dolly, Betty, and herself. Sea holiday was her mother's past, and her mother's laughter has become a thing of the past for the poet, as her mother was now dead. The poet still remembers how her mother would laugh at the photograph, remembering the sea holiday with a fondness as well as a sense of loss, because that time would never come back. In the same way, poet feels nostalgic thinking about her mother and her laughter, which has become a thing of the past. The words labored and ease are opposite to each other, but describe the same entity, which is loss. Now, let's move on to stanza number 4. Now, she's been dead nearly as many years as that girl lived, and of this circumstance there is nothing to say at all. It's silence, silence. In this last stanza, the poet recalls that it is nearly 12 years since her mother died, and the poet is consumed with grief but is left with no words to express her loss and pain. Here, the poet is totally absorbed in memories of her dead mother. The painful silence of this situation leaves the poet speechless, and the poet can feel the grief but is unable to express it through words. The silence caused by death makes the atmosphere gloomy, where no one is able to say any words. So the poem ends on that note. Now we have come to the end of the session. That is all for today's video.